As the troops returned from overseas following the war, Republican presidential candidate Warren G. Harding was promising a return to normalcy, ushering in one of the most conservative eras in American history. But the Teapot Dome scandal engulfed his administration and revealed the Interior Secretary to be in the pay of big oil, which had been plundering public lands. And the 1920s would turn out to be a decade of bold cultural experimentation mixed with political conservatism. An old culture of scarcity versus a new culture of abundance. This would be baptized the Roaring Twenties. Reformers feared that the doughboys, having discovered what some called the French way, would foist their new appetite for oral sex, as well as their diseases, on innocent American girls. The licentious French had, after all, offered to set up brothels for American soldiers like the ones that serviced their own fighting men, with the idea that it would maintain health standards and morale. But U.S. officials adamantly refused, and back home, moral crusaders had exploited wartime anxieties to shut down red light districts around the country, driving prostitutes underground and forcing them to seek protection from gangsters and pimps. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol in the United States. A reform backed by women's temperance groups, certain Protestant denominations, the reborn Ku Klux Klan, and some progressives. But as with the war on drugs later in the century, alcohol remained readily available for all who wanted it. And the war on alcohol ended up producing fantastic profits for a new stratum of criminals dominated by Italian, Irish, and Jewish immigrant gangs. Smedley Butler had seen some of the worst of the violence of World War I and the corruption that had ensued. But now, on sabbatical from the military, he was assigned the streets of Philadelphia.
Cleaning up Philadelphia was harder than any battle I was ever in.
Butler closed 600 speakeasies, including 2 patronized by the city's elite, who had him fired. Other repressive aspects of the new American life included immigration reform laws that imposed strict quotas on Southern and Eastern Europeans and entirely banned immigration from Japan, China, and East Asia. Anti-Semitism infested post-war America. Some associated Jews with communism and radicalism. Others thought Jews exerted too much influence in Hollywood, business, and academia. Top universities like Harvard slashed admission of freshman Jews from 28% in 1925 to 12% in 1933. Other measures were taken to eliminate undesirables. In 1911, as governor of New Jersey, eugenics enthusiast Woodrow Wilson had signed a law authorizing sterilization of convicts, epileptics, and the feeble-minded. Over the following decades, some 60,000 Americans would be sterilized, more than a third of them in California. Sexually active women were particularly targeted. Future German leader Adolf Hitler followed U.S. developments closely and claimed to model some of his own master race strategies on U.S. programs that he lauded but criticized for only going halfway. He would go further, much further. Between 1920 and 25, 3 to 6 million Americans joined the racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic Ku Klux Klan, which dominated politics in Indiana, Colorado, Oregon, Oklahoma, and Alabama, and sent hundreds of delegates to the 1924 Democratic Convention. It is astonishing to think that in 1925, 250,000 people watched 35,000 Klansmen march and rally through Washington, D.C. Hatred stalked the heartland. 14-year-old Henry Fonda, later a movie star, recalled watching a lynching in Omaha, Nebraska from his father's printing plant.
Put them up.
It was the most horrendous sight I'd ever seen. We locked the plant, went downstairs, and drove home in silence.
Finish it.
All I could think of was that young black man dangling at the end of a rope.
Hundreds more African Americans would suffer a similar fate, often advertised widely in advance and memorialized on postcards and in sound recordings. Lynchings became perverse rituals of desecration, replete with dismemberment and castration, and preserving body parts as souvenirs. Backwoods Bible colleges proliferated. Anti-intellectualism abounded. In 1925, a Tennessee schoolteacher named John Thomas Scopes was prosecuted, convicted, and fined for teaching Darwin's evolution theories in school. World War I marked the ascendancy of the U.S. and Japan, the war's two real victors. It had brought America an unprecedented collusion of bankers, businessmen, and government officials in an attempt to fix the economy and guarantee profits. By 1925, the U.S. was producing over 70% of the world's oil, which had powered the Allied wartime navies, airplanes, tanks, and other motorized vehicles. New York had replaced London as the center of the world economy, its size exceeding that of its next 6 rivals combined: Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Soviet Union, and Japan. Cynical and disillusioned from a brutal war, people were hungry to live at a level and experience life in a way they had never done before. A new materialism reigned based on credit, radios, movie palaces, and a new golden age of advertising that perfected the capitalist art form of manipulating not only consumer hopes and fantasies, but also fears and insecurities. Henry Ford sold 15 million Model Ts before switching in 1927 to the more fashionable Model A. Jazz, with its roots in the African-American South, became wildly popular. Flappers, petting, speakeasies, the Harlem Renaissance, sports. Wild new movies with and without sound flourished. Rebellious younger writers came on the scene. New expressionism in the works of E. E. Cummings, John Dos Passos, T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, Ezra Pound, William Faulkner, Lawrence Stallings, Sinclair Lewis, Eugene O'Neill, Willa Cather, Langston Hughes, and Dalton Trumbo. Many of them went to Europe. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote in 1920,
"Here was a new generation, grown up to find all gods dead, all wars fought, all faiths in man shaken."
Gertrude Stein, a lesbian writer living in Paris, famously commented, "All of you young people who served in the war, you are a lost generation." As the 1920s progressed, prosperity came to rest increasingly on the shakiest of foundations: unprecedented borrowing, massive speculation, and German war reparations. Agriculture was depressed throughout the decade. Auto manufacturing and road building slowed. Housing investment declined, and the gap between rich and poor grew sharply. Capital scrambled for profitable speculative outlets. To help pay Germany's war reparations, German Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau, a prominent Jewish industrialist, expanded economic, diplomatic, and even military ties with communist Russia, forging a bridge between the two nations that had been left out of Versailles in order to rebuild their war-ravaged societies. This infuriated not only England and France, but members of Germany's thuggish right-wing Freikorps, who were already up in arms about Germany paying its reparations. They assassinated Rathenau in 1922. Germany's economy suffered an inflation unlike any ever experienced in history. Wheelbarrows full of worthless German marks were burned for firewood. By 1923, a bankrupt Germany could no longer pay reparations to France and Britain, who in turn asked for relief on the billions in war debts they owed the U.S. government. "Absolutely not," replied the Spartan new Republican President Calvin Coolidge. By 1924, Europe's economies teetered on the edge of collapse. Then, and again 4 years later, commissions of bankers and businessmen led by Morgan and his allies drew up plans for German economic recovery that would guarantee continued, though more manageable, reparations payments. In essence, the U.S. was loaning money to Germany so it could pay reparations to France and Britain, who then used the money to service their war debts to the U.S. The bankers got rich, the people stayed poor. By 1933, Germany, though paying enormous reparations, owed even more money to the Allies than it had in 1924. It was in this climate of economic crisis in the West and communist revolution in the East that a new monster was born. It was called Nazism. Separate and apart from Germany, in Italy in 1922, Benito Mussolini and his fascisti took power and decimated the communists in bloody street battles. And as 1925 came to an end, it was the Morgan Bank that loaned Mussolini's government $100 million to repay its war debts to Britain and the U.S. Morgan was very pleased with Mussolini's repressive labor policies. Nazis stormed the city of Munich in 1923, led by World War I Corporal Adolf Hitler. His followers included war veterans unable to adjust to civilian life who clamored for the chance to put down communist uprisings and later formed the backbone of his stormtroopers. For his part in the failed coup, Hitler spent 9 months in jail refining his views. His shrill assertion that the German military had won the war only to be stabbed in the back by politicians at home was gaining more and more adherents. Hitler's cause would be greatly advanced when in 1929 the central bankers walked head-on into an unforeseen disaster, the Great Depression. Montagu Norman, who ruled the Private Bank of England from 1920 to 1944, and a paranoid anti-communist, anti-Semite who traveled incognito to avoid assassination, asked the governor of the New York Federal Reserve Bank to raise interest rates to slow Wall Street's soaring stock speculation. Ironically, Norman had been instrumental in convincing the previous governor to lower the rates 2 years earlier, which fueled the orgy of speculation that now rattled the system. Morgan's senior partner, Thomas Lamont, considered Norman the wisest man he had ever met. But the U.S. stock market, as it would in 2008, had diverted its money and credit away from production into speculation, borrowing to the hilt in order to loot the economy for huge profit. When the English and American banks raised their rates, the credit of the world tightened quickly, and too big to fail American banks went into a panic. Huge banks in Austria and Germany followed. The crash ended American loans to Germany, and Germany's industry collapsed entirely in the winter of 1931-2. Unemployment soared to over 30%, putting millions of angry young men in the streets. Capitalists and conservative politicians feared an imminent communist coup, and Hitler, Germany's most virulent anti-communist, was thus invited by the ruling classes into the government. Although still representing a radical minority party, in January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany.
Ist nicht mehr das Volk der Ehrlosigkeit, der Schande, der Selbstverfleischung, der Kleinmütigkeit und Kleinträumigkeit.
In speeches like this, Hitler touched a deep chord with many Germans, promising them something they could barely remember: pride. But disorder followed Hitler's rise to power when the Reichstag, the national parliament, mysteriously burned down. Hitler readily blamed the communists, and many were thrown in concentration camps. He quickly began a massive program of rearmament, which he made public in 1935. And once Hjalmar Schacht became his Minister of Economics, he received vital bank credits from Montague Norman, who in 1934 told a Morgan partner,
"Hitler and Schacht are the bulwarks of civilization in Germany. They're fighting the war of our system of society against communism."
Many American bankers agreed, trusting their friend Schacht and hoping that Hitler would repay at least some of the reparations and also crush the German communists. America was in deep crisis as well. Republican Herbert Hoover struggled ineffectively to quell the Great Depression. More than 20,000, possibly as many as 40,000, angry American veterans known as the Bonus Army descended on Washington, demanding war service bonuses not due to be paid until the year 1945.
I came to Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait for it till I get it if I have to wait till 1945.
They set up a tent city on the Anacostia Flats in Washington. They brought their wives and children. They lived by military discipline with daily parade and a strict no-drinking rule. General Smedley Butler arrived to lend moral support.
I know who's made this country worth living in. It's just you fellas. Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. Take it from me. This is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had. Pure Americanism.
He was mobbed by veterans wanting to speak to him. Until late that morning, he sat with them in their tents, listening to their tales of lost jobs and families in distress and old battle wounds. After demonstrators clashed with district police, President Hoover ordered General Douglas MacArthur to restore order. Convinced that the Bonus Army was the vanguard of a communist coup, MacArthur, not for the only time in his storied career, disobeyed presidential orders and rousted the veterans with tanks, bayonets, and tear gas. MacArthur, whose aides included later Generals Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton, pursued the fleeing veterans across the river and set their makeshift city aflame. But when the Bonus Army marched again the next year into Washington, there was a new president in the White House who sent his wife, Eleanor, to help serve the veterans 3 hot meals a day with coffee. One veteran remarked, "Hoover sent the army, Roosevelt sent his wife." Several days later, the Bonus Army voted to disband. The new president put many of the veterans to work in the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was in his famous inaugural address in March 1933 that Franklin Delano Roosevelt rallied the nation with his declaration.
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
It was the signature line of his extraordinary life. In truth, he was facing a disaster. Unemployment stood at 25%. The gross national product had fallen 50%. Farmers lost 60% of their income. Industrial production dropped over 50%. Between 1930 and 32, 20% of U.S. banks had failed. Bread lines formed in every town to feed the starving. Homeless walked the streets and slept in vast shanty towns known as Hoovervilles. There was no safety net to assist the desperate. Misery was everywhere. Roosevelt united Americans around a message of inclusion, the opposite of Hitler's.
The measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit.
In this vein, he called for strict supervision of all banking and credits and investments, and an end to speculation with other people's money. He proclaimed a New Deal, and although he could have nationalized the banks with hardly a word of protest, he chose a much more conservative course of action. He declared a 4-day national bank holiday, conferred with the nation's top bankers on his first full day in office, and signed the Emergency Banking Act, which was written largely by the bankers themselves. The banking system was essentially restored without radical change. And despite being accused of betraying his class, Roosevelt would ironically save capitalism from the capitalists themselves. Recognizing the failures of unfettered capitalism, Roosevelt unleashed the powers of the federal government. In his first 100 days in office, he passed legislation that established the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to save farming, the Civilian Conservation Corps to put young men to work in the forests and parks, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to provide federal assistance to the states, the Public Works Administration to coordinate large-scale public works projects, the National Recovery Administration, NRA, to promote economic recovery. And he passed the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, which separated investment and commercial banking and instituted federal insurance of bank deposits. He also repealed prohibition and stated now would be a good time to have a beer. Roosevelt assembled a team of visionaries. Among them were Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's chief aide, National Youth Administrator Aubrey Williams, Rexford Tugwell, Adolph Burl, and Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes. There was also the formidable Frances Perkins, the U.S. Secretary of Labor and the first woman ever appointed to the cabinet. They became known as the New Dealers. Henry A. Wallace, the young Iowa geneticist, would become one of their leading lights. He was from a Republican farming clan that had worked the land since it was frontier. His father, Harry, had served Presidents Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge as Secretary of Agriculture. Roosevelt told Wallace to take whatever actions necessary to repair the nation's devastated rural sector. His solutions were controversial. To stop overproduction, he paid farmers to destroy 25% of the cotton crop that was in the ground. He also ordered the slaughter of 6 million baby pigs, although he made sure the Agriculture Department distributed much of the pork, lard, and soap to needy Americans. Condemned by critics, Wallace took to the radio to defend his program. He called it a declaration of interdependence.
The ungoverned push of rugged individualism perhaps had an economic justification in the days when we had all the West to surge upon and conquer. But this country has filled up now and grown up. There are no more Indians to fight. We must blaze new trails in the direction of a controlled economy, common sense, and social decency.
In the end, Wallace's plan worked brilliantly. Cotton prices doubled. Farm income jumped 65% from 1932 to 36. Corn, wheat, pig prices stabilized. And the farmers became Wallace's staunchest supporters. For a man who had spent years perfecting a strain of hybrid corn and who believed that abundant food supplies were essential for a peaceful world, Wallace was horrified by the unfortunate message such policies sent.
The plowing under of 10 million acres of cotton and the slaughter of 6 million little pigs in 1933 were not acts of idealism in any sane society. They were emergency acts made necessary by the almost insane lack of world statesmanship during the period from 1920 to 1932.
The public, which blamed business for causing the Depression, welcomed Roosevelt with great enthusiasm, hoping he could spark a recovery. But he was an enigma, campaigning at times as a big government liberal, spinning out one new government program after another, and at other times as a budget-balancing conservative. Some thought him a socialist in the Eugene Debs, Norman Thomas tradition. Others a fascist or corporatist, supporting the merger of state and corporate power. His industrial recovery program, the NRA, regulated production, competition, and minimum wage rates, some of which smacked of Italian fascism. In reality, Roosevelt was actually more pragmatic than ideological. Nonetheless, he was misunderstood by big business. Openly opposing Wall Street made for smart politics, but it won the everlasting enmity of conservative Republicans who attacked his inflationary policies as unconstitutional. Printing press money, they called it. And worse yet, FDR took the U.S. off the gold standard. He sacrificed foreign trade and its profits in order to stimulate domestic recovery. He also took steps to reduce the country's small 140,000-man army.
The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans.
In 1934, retired General Smedley Butler re-entered the picture, presenting shocking information to the House Special Committee on Un-American Activities.
I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government.
Butler charged the anti-Roosevelt oligarchs, including J.P. Morgan's son Jack and the wealthy DuPont business clan, with trying to recruit him to lead an uprising of desperate veterans to force Roosevelt from office.
This is what I found. The key to Robert Forrest's fascist organization. Of course, they didn't call it fascism. They painted it red, white, and blue and called it Americanism. In here are the funds to see it through. Fantastic amounts subscribed by a few private individuals to whom money didn't mean anything anymore, but who wanted political power. Knew they could never get it by democratic means. In there are the names and addresses of the men who were designated to be America's first stormtroopers.
The press dismissed it as the business plot, a paranoid conspiracy. Henry Luce's Time magazine led the charge, but after hearing the testimony, the House committee, chaired by future Speaker of the House John McCormick of Massachusetts, reported that it had been able to verify all the pertinent statements made by General Butler and concluded that attempts to establish a fascist organization in the United States were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. The committee strangely chose not to call many of those implicated to testify, including failed 1928 Catholic presidential candidate Al Smith, Thomas Lamont of Morgan, Army General Douglas MacArthur, various high-placed corporate executives, as well as the former American Legion commander and the head of the National Recovery Administration. The tumultuous, frightening prospect of a fascist coup was popularized in the best-selling novel by Nobel Prize winner Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here, which depicted a similar series of events to those alleged by Butler. And later, a similar plot emerged in the very popular Frank Capra film, Meet John Doe.
All right. Now, supposing a certain unmentionable worm whose initials are DB was trying to use that to shove his way into the White House so he could put the screws on.
You sit there back of your big cigars and think of deliberately killing an idea that's made millions of people a little bit happier. An idea that's brought thousands of them here from all over the country, by bus and by freight and jalopies and on foot, so they could pass on to each other their own simple little experiences. Why, look, I'm just a mug and I know it, but I'm beginning to understand a lot of things. Why, your type's as old as history. If you can't lay your dirty fingers on a decent idea and twist it and squeeze it and stuff it into your own pocket, you slap it down. Like dogs, if you can't eat something, you bury it.
Al Smith